Welcome. I'm so glad you could join us. Please come in. Your presence honors us. Here at the Mr. Homemaker Podcast, we share our stories and challenges, collect the best expert advice, and offer one another support as we learn to manage our households. Your perspective and contributions will be very valuable. And just in time, today's discussion is about to begin. It is my pleasure to present Mr. Homemaker.
Thank you for joining me for this premiere of Season 2 of the Mr. Homemaker Podcast. If you're brand new here, I'd strongly encourage you to go back to Season 1 and listen to Episode 0, as well as the finale, at a minimum, to get an understanding of the journey that my wife and I have been on that brought us here today, with me bearing the mantle of Mr. Homemaker, while my wife serves as the sole breadwinner for our family. As we transition to Season 2, our goal will be to fill a gap sorely missing from our society today by developing a coherent theory of marriage and family life that men can embrace and take responsibility for implementing in their individual lives. This gap in how we understand ourselves and our relationships is a generational challenge. It's caused by several decades of rapidly changing values, attitudes, and lifestyles. The alarming consequences of these changes include a strong decline in the rate of marriage, or delays in marriage until much older than prior generations, and replacing that period of life with cohabitation and indulging in the hookup culture. An increasing number of young adults grew up to parents who were either cohabitating or married and divorced. They grew up with no healthy models of marriage or family life. It's understandable that these people would be apprehensive about their own prospects to have healthy, successful marriages and thriving families. Unfortunately, this means that the cycle of family dysfunction will only continue, if not accelerate. Men need to take responsibility for understanding how we got here, where these currents are taking us, and what we need to do to chart a better course for ourselves, our marriages, and our families. For men in the minority who have been unscathed by these changes over the past 50 or 70 years, and even more so for those who have fallen victim to these negative consequences, but remain resolute in their determination to break the cycle of family dysfunction, this season will be dedicated to helping you understand these cultural currents and helping you to develop the mindsets and strategies that will empower you to build healthy marriages and families and thriving children in your own life. Let me state clearly that I'm making no claims of any academic or professional expertise in these areas. Rather, I'm simply sharing the information and analysis that I have come across in my own journey to identify and evaluate the competing expert views on these issues, and share my insights through the lens of my personal experience as a husband and father. There is a fair amount of advice out there for men today, but the vast majority of it has one or more of the following critical flaws. First, much of it is too ideological. It is, at most, engaged in rhetoric and persuasion, but not thoughtful and even-handed consideration of complex issues. Second, it's too trendy. A great deal of it is designed to simply capitalize on the latest fads and trending hashtags to get as many clicks as possible, either by giving the masses what they want to hear or deliberately engineering some triggering post that will upset enough people to make something go viral. Third is much of it is too niche. It's part of an echo chamber where only one perspective is repeated over and over, and one set of conclusions is continually rationalized and justified. To offer a meaningful alternative to this content that's already out there, the approach on this podcast will be to examine issues and questions through multiple side-by-side lenses carefully, including considering our history and anthropology and sociology, considering survey and demographic data, and earnestly considering the specific claims and approaches that are advocated by the competing voices of today, as well as peeling back to take a look at the worldviews that underpin and motivate them. With this holistic approach, I believe we can arrive at a broadly acceptable core vision of marriage and family life that will cultivate human flourishing in a manner compatible with both the best research and common sense. Let me be upfront and transparent about the philosophical framework within which I am working. These are 4 premises that, unless it becomes absolutely necessary to reconsider or revise them, I will take as givens as I proceed through Season 2. The first is that I believe in objectivism. Reality and truth exist objectively. They exist independent of our individual perceptions, emotions, or imaginations. While people can and do have diverse subjective experiences and develop beliefs worthy of consideration, objective reality and truth remain the ultimate measuring sticks by which those perceptions and beliefs are evaluated. The second is human nature. I believe that the essential elements of the human experience are common to all people, and that diversity is the result of cultural and individual variations built on top of this shared foundation. It is not the case that cultural and individual diversity are evidence of distinct, different, separate human natures, or evidence that there is no common shared human nature that exists at all. Third, human flourishing. From the preceding concepts of objectivism and human nature flows the idea that the essential elements of human flourishing are objective realities common to all people. This means that what is good for us and what goods we should dedicate our lives to pursuing are for us to discover, not for us to invent. Finally, I will take an approach best described as structuralism. Structuralism is the sociological and anthropological school of thought that posits human institutions can only be meaningfully understood in their relationship to both the individual and other human institutions. For example, the institution of marriage is understood in the light shed on it by the institution of the family. The institution of the nuclear family is best understood in its context of the extended family and the geographic community in which it resides. Ultimately, these and all other institutions are shaped by human nature, and whether they are functioning or they are dysfunctional is an evaluation on the extent to which those institutions are serving or undermining human flourishing. Starting with these 4 premises and using the approach and lenses I described previously, the goal of Season 2 will be to arrive at firm answers to 4 questions. The first question is, what are the functions, the purposes of marriage and family? The second question, what are the essential elements of a man's role as a husband and father in a healthy marriage and family? Third, what specific duties and responsibilities must a man fulfill for his wife and his children? And fourth, what are the implications for how a man, a couple, and a family thrive in the context of their extended family, their community, and society at large? To further discuss, explore this outline and approach for Season 2, I am joined by my lovely wife, Kristen. Kristen, welcome to Season 2.
Wow, this is such a shift. I am overwhelmed by all of the stuff there is to talk about. Okay, so welcome to my show. The tables have turned. We're sitting on opposite sides of the table now. So I guess my first question is, so for those that are just joining us, could you give a brief explanation of like the past 6 months and this our first season of the Mr. Homemaker podcast? Like, what was the focus?
Yeah, so Season 1 was really more of a documentary where we were just recording our reflections and like problem solving as we grappled with the impasse we had reached of your work, my work, and like the eroding quality of our marriage and family time, because our work was demanding too much of our time and attention. We did not have enough time and energy and attention to give to our home life. And so over a 6-month leave of absence in which we experimented with readjusting our household duties and our lifestyle to figure out what shifts could we make to achieve the like quality of life that we wanted, and could we do that while still pursuing 2 full-time careers, one of which required me to like be physically away from the home 50 hours a week, let's say. And after 6 months we decided, no, we can't do all that. It's not possible. But much to our pleasant surprise, we realized that we can live off your income alone, meaning I don't have to be away from the house 50 hours a week. So that left us with a firm conclusion that I will continue to bear the mantle of Mr. Homemaker. And you will at some point establish a competing podcast called Mrs. Breadwinner.
Yes. Mine is going to be called Send Him Back to Work. No, so to put a bow on that, for Season 1, if you want to explore like whether that's possible and if that's something that you're interested in as a listener, go back and listen. We talked about all the steps we took to like, because it was not innately clear to us whether that was even possible to live off of one salary. How do you do that? How do you, like, what is the purpose of you as a family? All of that. I think we'll delve more into that this time. So then now we've taken like a pretty big shift in what this podcast is going to be based on what you've just described. Yeah. So what do those things connect?
Yeah.
And like, what was the impetus for this real shift to a philosophical look at the duties of a father and a family?
Well, I think one pattern that emerged pretty organically in our discussions is we kept asking ourselves, just as like part of our thought process, but also with the listener in mind, we kept asking ourselves, what do we wish we had known 5 or 10 years ago? What would we say to a 5 or 10 year younger version of us. You know, somebody who's crossing bridges into getting engaged or just married or expecting their first child. Because we realized over the past 6 months, there were so many things that we either took for granted or didn't even think to anticipate, to establish an assumption or expectation around. It just, you know, the various aspects of what it is like to put, you know, several children in childcare so that you can go to 2 jobs, so that one of you can take your entire paycheck and turn around and pay for all that childcare. And like that sort of snuck up on us in a way that I think we recognized we really didn't foresee this, and we didn't really have a plan for this. And how can we better communicate to somebody, you know, who's, you know, that's in their future, rather than like we've made a bunch of decisions in our past and now we're trying to adjust from that baseline.
Yeah.
And so I kept like spending more and more time thinking about, yeah, how could we communicate to a younger version of ourselves? And this season, the outline and approach to it is really my attempt to say, rather than maybe people in our peer group already have kids and are like in the throes of COVID and work-life balance, like they, I think, could have gleaned a lot of thoughts from season 1 about like, hey, now that we're in this boat that, you know, Mr. Homemaker was in, we can like try some of these approaches to figuring out what the next steps should be. How do we make these decisions about our careers and our family? So I think that was really the sort of natural target audience of season 1. But we did just have this constant thread of, yeah, I really wish you and I had had this conversation 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so now I'm trying to take that thread from season 1 and build it out so that really the target audience for season 2 is, you know, you and me 10 years ago, I think is like going to be the constant sort of conceptual listener that I want to keep coming back to. And maybe even people a little bit younger, a little bit older, but, you know, basically people who are at the stage of, I am seriously thinking about transitioning from being like an individual, just pursuing my career or my hobbies or whatever, like for whatever reason, I'm now transitioning into, I'm thinking that I'm at a place, or maybe my significant other and I are in a place where we need to start thinking seriously about our future. But I think when you're in that stage of life, you don't necessarily know how to think about that. And so I wanted to provide a framework, sort of some suggestions. Because again, I think one of the big elements of my developing thesis is that people who today are at that stage of life, if they try to ask their parents or just like subconsciously draw from their childhood experience, for a number of reasons, that will not serve them well.
Why not?
Because I think that marriage and family dynamics have changed too much in one generation.
Can you explain more what you mean?
Well, because I think a generation ago, or two, let's say 50 years ago, in the 1970s, there was an active shift away from an assumption that people should settle down and start a family young, and that women are natural caretakers and homemakers, and that men are natural providers. And I think like those assumptions were being challenged 50 years ago, but those were still like the prevailing assumption. The theme of the day was, how can we revise and resist these assumptions? So fast forward to today, I think that those assumptions have been destroyed. I think that's like something you read about in your history books or see in like a satirical skit on SNL as a depiction of family life from like pre-1970. I don't think it's a serious thing that is like part of people's makeup today. And so if you were raised in that transitional period, which would be the people we're talking about today, you fell somewhere on the spectrum of your parents either like were suspect of and skeptical of the models that they themselves were following, and they were teaching you not to follow in my, like, don't do what I'm doing. Like, I'm married and I had you, but actually you should not do what I did. Instead of getting married and having kids like I did, you should focus on yourself. Spend more time being single. Travel more. You know, really focus on your career. Don't do what I did. I think there's a whole generation of us who got that advice. And some people who are even a little bit younger were raised by people who got that advice. Right? So somebody who followed that advice of like, yeah, I spent my 20s and maybe into my 30s focusing on myself and my career and, you know, learn, like, finding myself. And then I eventually settled down in my mid 30s and had, so that would mean in the aughts, like around 2000, somebody who was born in 70 finally settled down. They were raised and followed the advice of, yeah, this whole like settling down young and raising a family thing, it's for the birds. Focus on yourself. Now that person had a kid 20 years ago. Right now there is out there a 20-year-old who was born in the aughts and their parents lived the life of individualism.
Right. So
now the question is, like, what model of marriage and family life does that 20-year-old have in their head? And does that model prepare them to be a successful husband and father?
Well, do you think that they're I have so many questions. So first, where do you think that, like, pursuit of individualism stems from, right? Because I will put out there that one theory is that those people were unhappy in the way in which their lives, those that were born in the 70s, married in the 2000s, that they recognized a flaw in...
The people born in the 70s recognized a flaw, or the people who raised those people?
The people who raised those people, who told them, like, go pursue your individual things, go find yourself,
if you were
focus
born
on your career.
In the 50s, let's say, you're a boomer.
You are not a boomer.
No, I'm not. So, yeah, if you were born in the 50s and you have your kids in the 70s, you are a boomer, and your mantra is... we're going to do the opposite of everything that our parents and grandparents did. Right. We're rejecting all of that.
But don't you think, like, if it were working for them, then there wouldn't have been a rejection. So is there, like... So the theory could be that there was severe dissatisfaction, which then also led to divorce rates beginning to climb at that time, because people felt like they got married very young, maybe before they really knew who they were.
You mean their parents did? They saw that their parents had done that, the greatest generation. And I think that's right. So you and I went into this a little bit in season 1. I wish I had the episode number in front of me. I don't. I'll put it in the show notes below. But we did have an episode dedicated to, we accidentally stumbled upon this conversation, the tip of the iceberg of these generational changes. And the nutshell version of that, where I landed as of a month or two ago, was that there were a lot of unforeseeable second and third order effects of World War II. To include, among many, there was great affluence in the West, and particularly in the United States, that flowed from a very active federal government that had been stood up and created a lot of jobs and industry around the war effort, and a lot of technological advances that were turned into, like, commercial businesses, and the automobile and the rise of the suburbs, and and a myriad of things that all converged in the wake of World War II. One thing that happened, and I'm not saying this is the most important thing, but I think it's an important note, is that Rosie the Riveter, the poster for women finding themselves in mass recruited into industry. Yeah. Like, come work at the factory because your boyfriend or fiance or husband is overseas. Right. Because a disproportionate number of able-bodied men who would be doing industrial jobs are instead fighting a war or preparing to or supporting people on the front lines, whatever, but they're
Right.
not in the factory. So let's get all these women in here to rivet these planes to send overseas.
Mm-hmm.
So you had a generation of women who like worked the 9 to 5
Yeah.
and earned a paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
And when the men came back and wanted to settle down behind their white picket fence and get their, you know,
Dinner's cooked for them.
well, and all, whatever, yeah. Well, let's come back to that. But the effect is you have all these women who have this idea in their head. When you were not around, and I was in my 20s working in the factory, I was doing fine in many ways. And I didn't have any responsibilities. I just had a paycheck
Right.
that I could spend on myself. I kind of liked that. And they told their children about this story of like, hey, you know, it's possible to just like not settle down and just earn money. You just got to get a job, and then you can just indulge in your own hobbies and not worry about being responsible to other people. And people were like, that sounds awesome. Why would I live behind this white picket fence? Like, you don't seem that happy, Mom. I don't want to do what you're doing. I'm going to do the opposite thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but I'm not defending living behind the white picket fence. I never have. I think that all of that was a weird, unintentional deviation from the historic natural relationships among people in a pre-industrial world. Now, I've been accused off air in the most well-meaning way of like romanticizing and glorifying like agrarian life. And I'm not necessarily saying that we should all like burn down the factories and go back to working in the fields. Maybe we should. Let's talk about that in a future episode. No, but I do think it's important to recognize that the last, 70 years of history is a small run of experience in the scope of humanity.
Right.
And in the same way that we have a lot of dietary problems in the affluent West today,
Mm-hmm.
because we have an overabundance of food that is high in fat and sugar and salt.
Mm-hmm.
And our bodies did not evolve in the past 50 or 70 or 100 years to adjust to this diet.
Right.
And I am suggesting similarly, I don't think that human nature has fundamentally changed in the past 50 or 70 or 100 years, but we have fundamentally changed the way we live our lives. And I think that it is not surprising that that would lead to unhealthy consequences, in the same way that if I eat as if I'm a caveman, but I have a bag of potato chips always at arm's reach, I will not be healthy. A caveman ate whatever he could find because he was working so hard to get it.
Right.
And the food he had was less processed, less refined,
It was probably unprocessed.
Well, he might have cooked it. I mean, he put it over a fire, or ground it up. He would have processed it by his own labor.
Right.
So yeah, I think the fundamental failure is a sort of cavalier attitude toward, or even just a total blindness toward, hey, we've very rapidly changed very fundamental things about our life.
Right.
We should assume there will be downsides. Which is not the same thing as saying we shouldn't change things. It's saying with the same enthusiasm that we're like, oh, this could be really fun. This could be really rewarding. This could be really good to make these changes. I think it is responsibility requires us to say, okay, now let's pause before we all jump in head first into this pool, and take for granted this like newfound wisdom of like, hey, we all realize that everything we've been doing for all of human history is wrong. Let's do the opposite stuff. Like, hey, before we do that, let's pause. What might the downsides be? And even if we're still going to do this, let's at least acknowledge so that we can mitigate the downsides and the risks.
Okay, so there's a couple of things. So I want to go back to your Rosie the Riveter comment for a couple of reasons. One, because I don't know if you realize this, but our 4-year-old we were doing we read the Ada Twist Scientist series, and Rosie Revere, engineer, and she
Yeah.
is the Rosie the Riveter character, right? Like, she has the little bandana in her hair. And so it just so happens that we also happen to have, we're big Parks and Recs fan, and we have like different bobbleheads. And so we have the Leslie Knope when she's dressed as Rosie the Riveter. And so our daughter the other day was like, it's Rosie Revere, engineer. And it was just funny. And I was like, do I go into like who Rosie the Riveter is? I started to explain, and then I was like, she was like, yeah, whatever, and like kind of walked away. So going back to Rosie the Riveter, but so at that moment, you are recognizing the downsides that there were for men returning, but are you acknowledging,
Which
like,
moment?
you're saying, like, so men came back from World War II.
Yeah.
They came back to homes that, like, before they had left were one way, and then it's similar, like, to the military, right? Like husbands are, home, they're kind of providing, like, the structure, the discipline around the house.
Then
they get deployed for 2 years. The wife is the center of the family and keeping it running, and then they come back, and it's this weird adjustment of like, you're not fitting in with the rhythms and routines of what we're doing. So similarly, like, husbands come back, they assume they're going to kind of go into their roles as like, I put my either my suit or my blue collar clothes on, and I go back out, and the women are like, no, like, I am really enjoying being in charge, having my own, feeling productive in a different way.
Sure.
And so how are you, I'm going to ask you a two-part question. One, are you saying that the women were incorrect in the value they were finding in that and the fulfillment, because they then pass that on to their children to say, like, you too can do this?
Yeah.
And then taking that to the next step, so how do you bridge that with now what we've just gone through, where you are advocating for a different role for fathers? And in fact, you are taking on the homemaker role now. So how do you...
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be putting more words in my mouth. I'm not sure I'm going as far as you're going. No, let me go back to a couple things. Part of the reason I think that the stereotype, the hypothetical, caricature of the 1950s mother, a member of the greatest generation, raising boomers, right? She had a job during World War II, etc. White picket fence, all of that. There were a couple other things that were happening there that I think watered the seeds of discontent. One is the deconstruction, the breakdown of extended family and community networks, such that the nuclear family was like each a little island in a sea of humanity. So a mother, a wife whose life centered on the home in 1950s did not have the same social network and support network and like community of sisters, mother, aunts and uncles, cousins. Instead, she found herself isolated because she's in, they moved to a city to follow a job. She lives behind a white picket fence. She doesn't know anybody there.
Right.
Husband's gone 40 plus hours a week. It's isolating.
Mm-hmm.
That is not what women experienced, in her mother and grandmother's generation. It was not. I am asserting that it is not the case that all throughout human history, homemaking women have just always lived this isolating life. I think that started in 1950. And I'm not saying it is the cause, but I think it watered the seeds of like, this is no way to live. I mean, that's probably right. That is no way to live. Which is why I'm not defending like, no, we should all go back to white picket fences. I think that was the beginning of the downfall. I think the other thing that goes along with it is before World War II, we did not have the like educational industrial complex that we have today of daycares, preschools, kindergartens, after school programs. Again, like we invented all that stuff around and after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So again, not only was the homemaker more isolated, but the homemaker's purpose was much less clear, and it was much less satisfying because they've now outsourced all the parenting. Right, so if you have a lot of support and you're constantly engaged in a pursuit of raising your children, I think you're very fulfilled and you're very supported. I think when you no longer have a purpose of raising your children because other people do that for you now, and you're all by yourself, you have no purpose, and it's totally unfulfilling. So again, I'm not saying that stereotypical hypothetical caricature of a 1950s woman was incorrect. I'm saying the reaction was not obvious or inevitable that the reaction should be, yeah, marriage and family life are the problem, and the answer is individualism. It was equally possible, and I would submit history has shown that it would have been better, to say, yeah, this whole nuclear family isolation and like industrialization of all aspects of human life is not so great, and we should go back to what we were doing a generation ago, where we have strong family and community ties. We spend a lot of time together as a family. I think, but instead of taking that step back towards something that was working, there was like, well, let's take another step forward toward the unknown.
Right.
And again, not to say that there's no pros, but it's just saying like, hey, we're experiencing downsides of this step we took. Let's take another step forward and see if that fixes the downsides. Maybe it did fix some of the downsides, but maybe it created more downsides, right? So like that's like sort of the vicious cycle I think we have suffered for the past 50 or 70 years.
It's interesting. I think you touched on something that we kind of think about often. By the way, I'm still not willing to cede that I think that I fear that the way that we have this conversation is characterizing that you believe.
Well, it was my intuition. I'm not saying that anything I just said, I'm not saying like I have concluded firmly that this is the case, but this is my working hypothesis that I want to really examine closely and either validate or revise throughout season 2.
Right. And I think that there is a potential that all of the conversation that we just had may bring people to the stereotype that I called you out on day 1 of our podcast, which was that you are a chauvinistic man who believes that we would all be better if we went back to the 1950s and women were at home and taking care of the household and raising the children, and the men were out going to work and then having a beer and not, and really like not engaging. And I think that you're saying that this is the trajectory that led us to where we are. But I think your underlying premise is not about the male or the female's responsibilities in this. And I'm going to put something out there. You tell me if I'm wrong. But that it is about your quarrel is with the focus on the individual versus the family and the degradation of the family as a worthwhile and maybe the primary place for like the primary goal, the primary focus is the family. What are your thoughts on kind of what I've said there?
No, I think that's basically right. I just want to, again, I understand the throwback to season 1 where you like made this accusation that I was advocating going back to the 1950s. And I just want to say it explicitly and succinctly. I don't even intuitively have an inclination toward the 1950s model. If anything, I am critical of the 1950s model because I think that was the first bad step. And then there have been a series of bad steps that followed it. And I'm trying to retrace the steps back to like where did we go wrong, and how do we get back to a place that works better?
So what?
And yes, by works better I mean.
Yeah. What is your ideal state?
I think the ideal state, the one that cultivates human flourishing, is one where people recognize themselves as part of a larger family, a larger community, that they are not so caught up in and preoccupied by their individualism. I think it is part of human nature that we are social and communal beings. And when we try to reject or resist that reality, we are less well off.
Okay. I think that's a solid and clear thesis. And I think it's interesting because I think that goes to, we've talked previously about Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone and how we, like, the creation of the society where we have a house with a yard and a fence, and we are kind of, and then at that point we had these social organizations like Kiwanis Club or Lions Club, and that was like the next level of, well, we still have this, we have ways to engage as a society, even though like we're not forced to do it by nature of the way we live anymore. But then like we continued to be like to kind of build more and more individualism. Meanwhile, I think that there is a natural search for what we had, right? So we've talked before about, the search for like fabricating family, right? Like you go, whether it's like you go to college and you build your little family around, like it's like the people you're with.
Talk about that all the time,
right?
Their
and
adopted family or their chosen family,
right? And then like you move into a community where we talk about, well, there are all of these organizations, all of these like functions that are really trying to recreate how do we build a community fabric, right? Like we talked about our friend who runs the Mom-Com and how like it's all about creating a place where moms can have mutual support, which was a family at that, like, right? When you were living with your extended family, or even like when you talked about agrarian life, right? And you see this movement, this was, 10 or 15 years ago, but towards like community gardening, towards like we built this, there's this community I remember in Virginia that like they have like this giant farm in the middle of the community.
They dedicated like a quarter of a city block to the community garden.
Right, but it was like, and everybody, if you live there, your responsibility is to be part of the gardening, and then you can like partake in the harvest. And it's like, so like we are like trying to manufacture the same things that we had, and I feel like it is, what you talked about before was the natural inclination toward family, community, social cohesion that we all seek, right? Even I think the people that I see that are very individualistic, like if I'm on Facebook, right? And they're like kind of, they push against or mock kind of the family. Even like you're in your 20s, you're trying to like find yourself. But the reality is everyone's always looking for someone, right? When you're going out to like out to a bar, you're like looking to meet someone. When you are like out you go to a, an event, like your natural tendency is not to be alone. You may be more of a loner and you may not want lots of people, but there is comfort in being with someone else, So it's just interesting that like that is, I think probably as we talk through this, that there is a natural flow toward the family and a structure that we've also at the same time rejected.
Well, and I think that structuralism, one of my 4 like premises, is not in vogue right now. I think like even
remind everybody that may not remember what structuralism, what you mean there.
Yeah, so structuralism is the paradigm, the lens of thinking about like sociology and human history, anthropology, thinking about it in terms of institutions exist to serve a function. They have structural relationships to one another, so that the way a marriage operates is influenced by how a family operates, and that is influenced by how a community operates, and vice versa. Like the influences flow in both directions. So healthy communities lead to healthy families and lead to healthy marriages, but also healthy marriages lead to healthy families, leads to healthier communities. But it's also true if something breaks, it's not just a matter of like, oh well, now like this this cell of the body is sick, but it's just that one cell of the body. Like, no. if a cell of the body or a tissue or an organ of your body is sick, your whole body suffers. And so thinking about society as a structure, as a system, where each part of it performs a function that affects all the other parts of it. It's basically the opposite of individualism. Basically saying we are not just like 380 million people in the United States who are 380 million individuals. It's that we are one society.
Right.
And that society is composed of multiple structures and functional, components.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it for now. I'm pretty sure that
nap time is over.
Son just woke up from his nap because I heard he can now reach the camera, and I'm pretty sure he just threw it on the floor.
That's all the time we have for today. We'll pick up the discussion in 2 weeks, as here in Season 2, we will move to a second and fourth Wednesday of each month. Between episodes, I would welcome the opportunity to engage with you on any of the social media platforms Mr. Homemaker is active. Please find the links below, or visit us at mr-homemaker.com to learn where we are active and what kind of content can be found on which platforms. Until next time, happy homemaking.
Thank you so much for attending today's discussion with Mr. Homemaker. Please take this opportunity to subscribe, like, and share this episode with your spouse, relatives, and friends. We further invite you to access complimentary information and resources at our website, mr-homemaker.com. There you will also find links to join the discussion via email or social media. And please, support the Mr. Homemaker podcast and receive merchandise and membership benefits on patreon.com. Until next time, farewell.